government, but they don't know what government wants because their interface with government is confusing. It's not just complex. It's not just expensive. It is confusing.
Now, if you look at the disasters, I mean, to me, the single biggest disaster in Providence lately starts at the mall and stretches across to College Hill in that wide band of buildings that sort of popped up in the late 90s, just after the year 2000. One was supposed to have been high-cost residential housing. That's turned into a mall. That to me is a disaster.
Well, to me, Providence Place, which was designed during a brief hiatus in the march toward a modernist, radiant future, the Providence Place Mall was designed, if not brilliantly, by Friedrich St. Florian, then at least in a style that is traditional and that people tend to like. The buildings across the street, the GTEC building and the Water Place luxury apartment buildings and the Blue Cross Blue Shield building, I don't know whether Blue Cross Blue Shield is actually still there, but those buildings were a volte-face, a 180-degree turn away from the buildings that were built in the 1990s, the Providence Place Mall, the Westin Hotel, and other buildings right along Francis Street there, which are none of them are great architecture. But the fact is, if you were building architecture, style, design that people like, it doesn't need to be great. Whereas if you're building a modernist building that has resulted from architecture throwing out all the tools of history of architecture and having only planar surfaces as a result to work with, you have to be a genius to create something that's beautiful. And we haven't had that yet in Providence.
Well, I see architecture as when somebody tells me they're an architect, I think that is kind of the pinnacle of the artisan, because architecture has to be, or at least should be, the perfect intersection of form and function.
Well,
and I think from a building standpoint, if you lean one way or the other, it can completely cut the legs out of any business building. I mean, if it looks great but is totally useless, nobody's going to go there. If it's completely functional but is white walls and brick, nobody's going to want to go there.
Well, going back to Vitruvius, who wrote the foundational treatise of classical architecture, he said that buildings need to have firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, actually. And that means strength, usefulness, and beauty. And from well before Vitruvius on until the middle of the last century, architects sought to play out those values in everything they built, and they accrued hundreds and thousands of years of experience in doing so that was handed down from generation to generation, to architect. And in the middle of the last century, that was all thrown out the window, and the modernists decided to start from square one. But starting from square one isn't very smart unless you have a problem, and there was no problem, but modernists said there was a problem because Hitler liked traditional architecture. Well, you can't blame the buildings.
Well, unfortunately, we've only got about 2 minutes left, and we're going to continue this conversation on a long-term basis.
That's good.
But 195, in a nutshell, if it's possible, is what process should take place there, and what would you like to see come from there?
195 is heading into a buzzsaw, it seems to me. The developers who come in are shown something called the Developer's Toolkit, which shows a series of buildings as models that generally tend to try to have it both ways, meld modernism with traditional. And it's disappointing to anyone who has any sense of aesthetic. And so what should happen here in Providence and in Rhode Island is that Governor Raimondo should go to all of these development committees and design review committees and tell them to toe the line and build and suggest that developers build what people like. Developers will applaud. People will applaud. Development will become easier and cheaper as a result of developers not having to pull their hair out whenever they interface with government.
There you go. Well, we're going to be, like I said, we're going to be posting some of your writings so that we can explore that in more depth, and we were going to have you on again in the coming weeks. You've been listening to The Coalition Radio at coalitionradio.us, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and, of course, on the Mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. Tweet us some of your questions or comments about architecture, and so that we can focus on them in the coming weeks. And, again, you'll be able to listen to this podcast live, coalitionradio.org. See you next week.